Caleb Thompson had always believed that a farm was more than just land. It was a legacy. A third-generation farmer in rural Iowa, Cale ran Thompson Acres with the same grit and heart his father and grandfather had shown before him. The 150-acre farm, with its sprawling fields of corn and soy, a red barn that had weathered decades of storms, and a modest farmhouse painted in warm, welcoming hues, was his sanctuary. Every furrow in the field and every creak of the barn door echoed stories of perseverance, family pride, and freedom from modern-day tyranny. For Cale, the farm wasn't only a livelihood, it was the embodiment of independence. In an age when corporate interests and bureaucratic red tape threatened personal autonomy, his land offered a retreat, a place where tradition and self-reliance reigned supreme. Whether he was driving his trusty John Deere through golden fields at sunrise or sharing stories with neighbors on his wraparound porch, Cale embraced a lifestyle defined by hard work and honest freedom. But even in this bucolic haven, forces of conformity had begun to encroach. Over the past few years, a new homeowners association, HOA, had expanded its influence beyond the neatly trimmed lawns of suburban developments and into rural areas. At the center of this bureaucratic behemoth was Kerren Baxter, a self-appointed enforcer whose iron-fisted approach had earned her a reputation as the queen of conformity. Dressed always in crisp blouses and perfectly pressed skirts, Kerren saw the world in black and white, and her idea of order was absolute. One clear Saturday morning, as Cale was checking the irrigation system on a row of corn, a shiny black SUV rolled up along the gravel drive leading to his farmhouse. Out stepped Kerren, clipboard clutched tightly in her manicured hand and an expression of righteous purpose on her face. "Mr. Thompson," she announced in a clipped tone, "I'm here on behalf of the HOA to inform you that your property is in violation of our community standards." Cale paused, wiping grease from his hands on a worn denim rag. "I'm sorry, but my farm isn't part of any HOA," he replied, his voice steady though his eyes narrowed. Kerren's gaze swept dismissively over the weathered barn, the untamed wildflowers bordering the driveway, and the natural landscape that defined Thompson Acres. "That may be, but our guidelines extend to all properties in this district. Your unapproved barn paint, unsightly signage, and even the arrangement of your livestock enclosures disrupt the aesthetic harmony we demand." She thrust a thick envelope into his hand. Its embossed seal and formal language were designed to intimidate. "Consider this your final warning," she declared. "Failure to comply will result in fines and further legal action." Cale unfolded the paper slowly. Every item on the list, alleged infractions ranging from improper fence height to unauthorized use of rustic decor, was as absurd as it was baseless. His farm had been in his family for generations, managed according to local agricultural codes, not the arbitrary dictates of an HOA bent on imposing suburban order on the countryside. As neighbors looked on from a distance, whispers and side glances betrayed their disbelief. For many, Kerren's intrusion was the final straw, an unwarranted attempt to police the natural beauty and authenticity of rural living. Cale's response was measured but firm. "I respect tradition and take pride in maintaining my land," he said. "But I won't allow anyone, especially not an overzealous enforcer, to dictate how I run my farm." Kerren's eyes flashed with indignation. "Your noncompliance will not be tolerated," she snapped before turning on her heel and striding away, leaving behind a trail of scandalized whispers. That afternoon, in the quiet sanctuary of his farmhouse, Cale spread the envelope across his kitchen table. With the fading sunlight casting long shadows over heirloom photographs and handwritten ledgers, he began to review local ordinances and property rights documents. It was clear that not only were Kerren's demands unjustified, they were entirely unenforceable. His property, governed by agricultural law and his own hard-fought independence, was not subject to the whims of an HOA that had no right to control a family farm. In that moment, a quiet resolve settled over him. The confrontation had lit a fire beneath his steady exterior, a promise that he would not allow arbitrary rules to tarnish the legacy of Thompson Acres. As the last light of day vanished and the stars emerged over endless fields, Cale made a vow. He would stand up to this intrusion, not just for himself, but for every farmer, every homeowner, and every free spirit who believed that true freedom meant living by one's own rules. The following morning, as the rooster crowed and dew still clung to the fields, Cale found himself facing a new assault on his freedom. The envelope Kerren had left behind was no longer the only piece of paper affixed to his weathered front door. In its place, a freshly printed notice now lay taped to the door in bold, intimidating typeface. This notice not only reiterated the previous warnings about non-conforming property aesthetics, but now demanded that Cale alter the appearance of his farm immediately. It even stipulated that if he failed to comply within 48 hours, a fine of $1,000 would be levied, and hinted at further legal action. Cale read the notice aloud in a low, steady voice as he walked around the farmhouse. Violation: unapproved barn color, improper signage, unauthorized display of rustic farm elements. Each point was preposterous to him. His barn's faded red paint was a badge of honor, a relic of his forefathers' labor, weathered by time and storms. The old wooden signs that advertised Thompson Acres were handcrafted with love and history, not meant to match any cookie-cutter aesthetic. Before Cale could process his mounting frustration, a sharp knock echoed across the porch. Opening the door, he was met by two individuals in uniform, their clipboards held out as if they were delivering the verdict of a Supreme Court. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," one said in a rehearsed tone. "We are compliance inspectors from the HOA. We are here to verify that your property conforms to community standards. Please provide us with access." Cale's jaw tightened. "I appreciate your concern, but my property isn't governed by your rules. I adhere to local agricultural and zoning laws, which clearly do not grant you authority over my home." His calm, measured tone belied the storm brewing inside him. The inspectors exchanged uncertain glances as a voice crackled from a portable speaker mounted on a nearby pickup truck. "Mr. Thompson, the rules apply to every property in our district." Kerren's voice rang out, authoritative and unyielding. "Noncompliance will result in immediate fines and further action. I advise you to cooperate." Standing his ground, Cale replied, "My farm is managed according to laws that protect my right to live and work as I choose. I will not allow your arbitrary standards to dictate the character of Thompson Acres." The inspectors, caught in the middle of Kerren's theatrics and Cale's resolute defiance, hesitated before finally retreating with a curt, "We'll be back," leaving behind a palpable tension. Inside his farmhouse later that day, Cale sat at his sturdy kitchen table, an heirloom passed down through generations, while reviewing the documents in front of him. He took digital photographs of every notice, every sticker on his door, and even a short video of the inspector's visit. With practiced diligence, he then emailed a copy of his evidence to the local zoning board, citing specific municipal codes that supported his right to manage his property as he saw fit, not one to let injustice go unnoticed. Cale also posted a detailed account of the incident on his community blog. In his post, he explained how a group claiming to represent the HOA had attempted to force their way onto his property, demanding compliance with rules that had no legal basis. "I've always believed in preserving our traditions," he wrote, "and that means protecting our rights from arbitrary intrusion. Thompson Acres belongs to those who work it, not to a faceless bureaucracy that seeks to impose a manufactured vision of order." Within hours, comments flooded in. Neighbors, many of whom had quietly suffered similar intrusions or witnessed Kerren's heavy-handed tactics elsewhere, expressed their support. Some shared their own stories of receiving ridiculous fines or unwanted inspections, while others praised Cale for standing up for his rights. The collective voice of the community, once subdued by fear of reprisals, began to swell with indignation. As twilight descended over the fields, Cale meticulously organized every piece of evidence he'd gathered. Each printed notice, every email confirmation, and the snapshots of uniformed inspectors became a bulwark against the creeping tyranny of the HOA. Sitting on his back porch under the vast, starry sky, he felt not only the weight of his responsibilities as a steward of Thompson Acres, but also a renewed determination to protect his heritage at all costs. In that quiet moment, with crickets chirping in the background and the gentle rustle of corn in the breeze, Cale vowed, He would not be bullied by Kerren's arbitrary rules. Tomorrow, he would begin planning his next move, one that would expose the injustice for all to see and rally his community against this overreach. The fight for his farm had only just begun. Over the next several days, Kerren and the HOA upped their ante in an attempt to subdue Cale's stubborn defiance. What had begun as isolated warnings soon morphed into a full-scale campaign of intimidation. Anonymous flyers began appearing at local postboxes and on community bulletin boards, each bearing the stern warnings of noncompliance and community violation. The language was uniform and cold. All properties must adhere strictly to HOA-approved aesthetics. Failure to do so will result in immediate fines and legal action. Late one afternoon, as Cale was checking the irrigation lines on a vast expanse of corn, his cell phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. A monotone voice, devoid of empathy, delivered a chilling ultimatum. "Mr. Thompson, you are required to schedule an inspection of your property within the next 48 hours. Noncompliance will result in additional fines and may even lead to property seizure." The threat was wrapped in bureaucratic jargon, but its intent was clear: a coercive bid to force him into submission. Cale calmly informed the caller that any inspection would have to be conducted by legally sanctioned personnel, and that he would only comply if proper notice was given in writing. He then pressed the record button on his phone, adding the conversation to his ever-growing dossier of evidence. Around the same time, whispers spread among neighboring farmers and rural residents. Several shared stories of receiving similar notices, warnings for improper barn signage, unsightly livestock enclosures, and even fines for disrupting the scenic rural landscape. One elderly farmer tearfully recounted how he'd been harassed for keeping his prized red tractor in view, claiming it disrupted the uniformity of the community. Determined to expose these abuses, Cale began installing discreet security cameras at strategic points around Thompson Acres. Every morning, he reviewed the footage with meticulous care, recording the precise times when unidentified inspectors or HOA enforcers appeared at his property. The evidence was undeniable. His land, managed with decades of tradition, was being arbitrarily targeted. In a chance encounter at the local feed store, Cale met Mary Ann, a longtime resident who admitted in a hushed tone, "I've seen Kerren's flyers and received fines for things that aren't even in our contracts. It's all a scheme to squeeze money out of us." Her words, tinged with both fear and resignation, confirmed what Cale had long suspected. The HOA was less concerned with community improvement than with consolidating power and extorting funds. Spurred on by these revelations, Cale began organizing informal gatherings with other affected landowners. Over cups of coffee at the town diner, they compared notes, shared copies of dubious fines, and planned how to collectively challenge the HOA's overreach. Cale's community blog, already buzzing with support from his earlier post, soon became a hub for these discussions. Neighbors began to submit their own evidence, scanned letters, photos of unauthorized inspectors, and even video clips of unannounced visits. Every new piece of evidence added weight to Cale's cause. He compiled a comprehensive dossier that included not only the original notices, but also transcripts of phone calls, photographs of suspicious inspectors, and screenshots of social media posts where other residents detailed their own run-ins with the HOA. Legal citations from local zoning codes and property rights statutes underscored his argument that Thompson Acres was never subject to these arbitrary rules. As tension mounted, a sense of solidarity began to emerge among the rural residents. What had once been isolated incidents were now part of a pattern, a systematic abuse of power by an organization that claimed to represent the community, but instead operated with the ruthlessness of a private army. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak out now found their voices, emboldened by the shared determination to reclaim their rights. By the end of the week, Cale's dossier had grown into an undeniable body of evidence. Late one evening, as he sat in his study with the soft hum of farm machinery in the background, he reviewed the day's footage once more. His eyes narrowed with resolve as he made notes on inconsistencies in the HOA's records and planned his next steps. Tomorrow, he decided, He would hold a meeting with all the affected landowners, a public forum where they could demand accountability and expose the corruption at the heart of the HOA. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the legacy of his family's hard work and the gentle rustling of the cornfields, Cale realized that his fight was no longer just about one farm. It was about every rural property that had been targeted by an overreaching bureaucracy. With renewed determination, he vowed to continue gathering evidence, rallying his community, and ensuring that the abuses of Kerren and her cronies would not go unchallenged. One cool morning, as the golden light spilled across Thompson Acres, Cale was met with a sight that epitomized the HOA's latest attempt at tyranny. Arriving at his farmhouse, he found his driveway blocked by a pair of rented utility trucks emblazoned with the HOA's logo and the words Community Compliance Unit. Out of the trucks emerged a small team of uniformed enforcers armed with measuring tapes, paint swatches, and stern expressions. Their mission: to forcibly remedy every aspect of his property so that it conformed to Kerren's ridiculous standards. At the forefront stood Kerren Baxter herself, her face a mask of indignation. "Mr. Thompson," she bellowed, "if you do not surrender your house keys immediately so that we can inspect and, if necessary, remodel your property, further action will be taken." Her demand, as preposterous as it was intrusive, echoed across the fields. Cale stepped forward, unflinching. "I've told you before, my property is my own. I abide by local laws and agricultural codes, not by your arbitrary rules. I will not hand over my keys, and I will not allow you or your enforcers to dictate how I run my farm." His voice was calm, but carried the weight of decades of tradition and hard work. A hush fell over the gathered onlookers, neighbors and local residents who had come to witness the showdown. Several began recording the confrontation on their phones, capturing every word and gesture. One bystander shouted, "This is our community, not your personal dictatorship, Kerren," as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Unwilling to back down, Kerren's enforcers fumbled with their clipboards. One of them, uncertain of the legality of the situation, hesitated and muttered, "Sir, are you aware that this directive comes from the HOA?" Kerren snapped, "Do not question my authority," as she waved her hand dismissively. Seizing the moment, Cale calmly produced a printed copy of the relevant municipal code and property rights legislation. According to Section 14.7 of our local ordinance, my property is exempt from these fabricated rules. I have every right to maintain my farm as I see fit. His words, clear and unwavering, cut through the tension like a scalpel. As the standoff continued, more neighbors stepped forward. A local rancher shouted, "You can't just take over someone else's farm," while another resident added, "Kerren, your rules have no place in the countryside." The public outcry grew louder, and even one of Kerren's enforcers began to doubt the legitimacy of their orders. Not long after, Cale convened an impromptu community meeting at the nearby town hall. There, in front of a packed room of sympathetic farmers and local residents, he laid out the evidence he'd amassed over the past weeks. With his dossier spread across a long table, he presented video footage of unauthorized inspections, copies of bogus fines, and legal documents proving that Thompson Acres was never subject to the HOA's jurisdiction. "This," he declared, "is not just about one farm. It's about our right to live and work without being bullied by arbitrary, out-of-touch rules. Our community deserves transparency and respect, not the tyranny of Kerren Baxter." The room erupted in applause and fervent agreement. Neighbors shared their own stories of harassment and bizarre fines. The collective anger and determination in the room was palpable, a unified stand against an overreaching authority. As the meeting adjourned, plans were set in motion for a formal petition to be submitted to local government officials, demanding an immediate investigation into the HOA's practices. That afternoon, as Cale walked back to his farmhouse beneath a sky streaked with vibrant sunset hues, he felt a surge of vindication. His refusal to bow to Kerren's outrageous demands had not only protected his farm, but had sparked a movement. The seeds of rebellion were sown in that town hall meeting, and the community was now united in the fight for their rights. Even as Kerren's enforcers reluctantly packed up their equipment, the message was clear. When people come together to stand up for what is right, even the most arbitrary rules cannot prevail. Cale's steadfast resolve had turned an attempted takeover into a rallying cry for freedom, a reminder that true power lies in unity and in the courage to say no. As the battle between Thompson Acres and the HOA raged on, Kerren Baxter grew increasingly desperate. With the community rallying behind Cale and mounting evidence exposing her abuses, she decided to pull one final, drastic maneuver, a move that would ultimately bring her instant karma. One chilly early morning, as fog blanketed the fields and the farm lay in serene silence, Kerren arrived at the farmhouse with a look of unbridled fury. In her hands, she clutched a thick envelope and a smartphone, and her eyes burned with determination. "Mr. Thompson," she demanded in a shrill voice, "I demand that you hand over your house keys immediately so we can secure your property for a mandatory inspection." Her words, laced with threat, echoed across the dewy lawn. Cale, already prepared for her antics, stepped onto his porch with measured calm. "I'm sorry, Kerren, but I will not surrender my keys," he replied, his voice even yet unyielding. "My farm is my private property, and I abide by the law, not your whims." Enraged by his defiance, Kerren's face contorted. In a moment of sheer desperation, she pulled out her phone and, without hesitation, dialed 911. "This is an emergency," she shrieked into the receiver. "I'm witnessing a blatant refusal to comply with community safety standards. I demand that officers respond immediately." Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens shattered the pre-dawn calm. Uniformed police vehicles pulled up along the gravel drive, and officers hurried toward the scene. Neighbors, now gathered at a safe distance and recording the unfolding drama, watched in astonishment as Kerren's plan spiraled out of control. When an officer reached the porch, Cale greeted him with respectful composure. "Good morning, officer. I understand there's been a complaint, but I assure you there's no disturbance here, only a disagreement over property rights." Kerren, red-faced and fuming, attempted to interject. "He's endangering our community by refusing to comply. He's a threat to public safety," she cried, waving her phone as if it were evidence. The officer, reviewing the situation with a practiced eye, asked calmly, "Ma'am, do you have any official documentation that grants you the authority to demand possession of someone's keys?" Kerren fumbled with her phone, her earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of protocol. I have the HOA guidelines," she stuttered, her voice losing its edge. The officer's tone remained even as he explained, "Without a proper warrant or legal basis, I cannot compel you to seize private property. This is a matter for civil, not criminal, resolution." As the officers took statements and began reviewing the evidence on site, it became increasingly clear that Kerren's desperate call was not only unfounded, it was an abuse of power. Meanwhile, one of her hired investigators was caught on one of Cale's security cameras sneaking around the side of the farmhouse. The incriminating footage, capturing the investigator's furtive movements and clearly indicating unauthorized surveillance, was later saved as part of Cale's growing dossier. At the next HOA meeting, now convened in a packed town hall with a heavy air of anticipation, Cale wasted no time in presenting the video evidence. The room fell silent as the footage played on a large screen. Kerren's frantic call to 911, the disorganized response of her enforcers, and the unauthorized investigators skulking about the property. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the evidence laid bare Kerren's blatant abuse of power. A board member finally spoke up, his voice trembling with indignation. "This is unacceptable. Kerren's actions are not only illegal, they're a betrayal of our community's trust." The consensus was overwhelming. Kerren had crossed every line, and her final, desperate move had sealed her fate. As the meeting adjourned amid thunderous applause from the assembled residents, it was clear that Kerren's time as the tyrannical enforcer was at an end. Cale's unwavering resolve had not only protected his farm, but it also exposed the corruption and overreach of an organization that had long operated in darkness. In that moment, the community experienced a profound, cathartic victory, a clear message that no one was above the law. In the wake of Kerren's final desperate move, the community rallied with unprecedented vigor. The once feared HOA, built on arbitrary rules and unchecked authority, began to crumble under the weight of public outcry and mounting legal evidence. An emergency town meeting was scheduled at the local community center, a modest hall filled to capacity with farmers, families, and neighbors determined to reclaim their rights. Cale, with his comprehensive dossier in hand, took the stage. Today, we stand together not only for our farms and homes, but for our right to live without arbitrary interference, he declared, his voice resonant with conviction. He recounted the long string of abuses, baseless fines, unauthorized inspections, and the outrageous demand for house keys that led to Kerren's infamous 911 call. We will not be bullied into submission, he continued, and we demand accountability for those who have abused their power. One by one, residents shared their own stories of intimidation. An elderly farmer tearfully recounted how he'd been fined for having a weathered tractor in view, while a young family described the stress of constant, unannounced inspections. The collective testimony painted a damning picture of an HOA more interested in profit and control than in fostering a genuine community spirit. Amid the rising tide of opposition, several disillusioned board members, once silent accomplices, stepped forward to denounce Kerren's autocratic behavior. In a historic, unanimous vote later that evening, the board resolved to remove Kerren from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with jubilant cheers and heartfelt applause from a community that had long suffered under her arbitrary rule. In the days that followed, local authorities, spurred on by the overwhelming evidence presented by Cale and the impassioned voices of the residents, launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. Financial records, internal emails, and the mountain of documented abuses revealed a systematic pattern of corruption and extortion. Headlines in regional newspapers blared, HOA tyranny toppled. Kerren Baxter's reign ends in scandal. For Cale, watching the collapse of the old regime was a bittersweet triumph. Thompson Acres, once the epicenter of Kerren's invasive demands, now stood as a beacon of individual freedom and community resilience. Neighbors, who had once lived in quiet fear of fines and secret inspections, now gathered openly at local markets and town halls, united by their newfound determination to keep their rights intact. The newly elected HOA board, composed of honest, community-focused residents, immediately set to work drafting a new charter. Their vision was simple yet revolutionary: an organization built on transparency, accountability, and respect for individual property rights. Gone were the days of secret fines and arbitrary rules. In their place would be policies that celebrated diversity and protected the legacy of every farm and home in the district. As the oppressive shadow of Kerren's rule receded, the atmosphere in the community transformed. The air, once thick with tension and fear, now buzzed with cautious optimism and a collective resolve to prevent future abuses. Cale often sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over endless fields, and felt an overwhelming sense of vindication. The battle had been long and arduous, but the victory was undeniable. Justice had prevailed. In that moment, the legacy of Thompson Acres became a symbol not only of personal freedom, but of the power of unity. The downfall of Kerren Baxter, precipitated by her own desperate actions, served as a stark reminder that no one is above the law. The community's hard-won triumph would echo for generations, a testament to the idea that when people stand together, even the most entrenched tyranny can be overthrown. Following the dramatic upheaval, local authorities moved swiftly to hold the old HOA accountable. In a series of high-profile court hearings, the extensive evidence compiled by Cale, videos, photographs, emails, and sworn testimonies, became the cornerstone of a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of all affected residents. City officials levied substantial fines against the HOA for illegally enforcing rules on properties outside their jurisdiction. Judges condemned the association's arbitrary tactics, declaring unequivocally that no homeowner's rights could be compromised by secret fines and unauthorized inspections. Media outlets provided round-the-clock coverage as the legal proceedings unfolded. Headlines such as "Community Triumph," "HOA Scandal Exposed," and "Tyranny Overthrown," "Residents Reclaim Their Rights," dominated local news. Several former board members faced criminal charges ranging from fraud to embezzlement, and the legal fallout sent shockwaves through the region. The court's swift, decisive rulings underscored one thing: abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. In a final symbolic power move, the newly reformed HOA board, composed entirely of community-elected residents committed to transparency, vowed to dissolve the archaic systems that had enabled Kerren's reign. They immediately set about drafting a new charter that enshrined fairness, accountability, and respect for individual property rights. For Cale and his neighbors, this legal reckoning was not merely a personal victory. It was a watershed moment that safeguarded their future. While the legal storm raged over the HOA, Kerren Baxter's personal life disintegrated in tandem with her public disgrace. Once the unyielding enforcer of draconian rules, she now found herself vilified in local newspapers and scorned on social media. Rumors spread that her lavish lifestyle, long funded by misappropriated HOA fines, was crumbling under the weight of mounting legal fees and public humiliation. Within days of her removal, former allies and board members distanced themselves, and Kerren was forced to resign from any position of authority. Her once pristine reputation was in tatters, and even attempts to secure a new job in property management were met with derision. At her first day at a reputable firm, one known for its modern ethical practices, a co-worker quipped, "I hope you like following orders now, because that's all you'll be doing." The remark, dripping with irony, was the final nail in the coffin of her former power. For Cale and the community, Kerren's downfall was a poetic justice long in coming. The same tactics she had used to intimidate and extort had been turned against her. Her desperate calls, her fraudulent demands, and her abuse of power were now public record, a permanent testament to the fact that no one is above the law. Months after the tumultuous events that had rocked the community, the landscape had changed dramatically. Thompson Acres stood proudly among the other properties, a symbol of resilience and the triumph of individual rights. The oppressive atmosphere once imposed by the HOA had given way to a vibrant community united by freedom and mutual respect. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rolling fields, Cale sat on his farmhouse porch enjoying a moment of calm. Neighbors strolled by, exchanging hearty greetings and sharing laughs about days gone by. In a final act of defiant humor, a longtime friend ambled over with a handmade HOA violation notice printed on brightly colored paper. The notice read, "Violation, excessive freedom. Penalty, eternal joy." Cale chuckled, shaking his head as he murmured, "They really tried." The remark, simple yet profound, became a rallying cry for the community. It was a reminder that no matter how high someone may climb on a ladder of entitlement, the truth and unity of a determined people always deliver instant karma. As twilight deepened and stars began to twinkle over the open fields, the sound of friendly chatter and laughter filled the air. The memory of Kerren's tyranny had faded into a cautionary tale, a reminder that true power lies in community, not in the arbitrary rules of an overreaching enforcer. With a satisfied smile, Cale leaned back in his chair, content in the knowledge that the battle had been fought and won not by the force of a bully, but by the collective will of a community that refused to be intimidated. The legacy of Thompson Acres and of every property that had once been targeted by unjust authority would live on as a beacon of freedom for generations to come. Fade to black.